Moving on to the next one. Ventus777777 says, I think the whole that this whole post and patch cycle has been purposely not light, but less intense, question mark, on purpose. And I don't mean that in a bad way, mostly. Obviously, that this post-patch cycle is a way that it is in some small level because of Final Fantasy 16. Lighter workload for Creative Business Unit 3 to help the game for a perfect for launch. But I think that there is also an argument to be made that this is light and it doesn't want you to feel forced to play. The post-patch story, while I love it, is not as intense as other post-patch stories tend to be, since the Bloody Banquet is because of Endwalker, and in fact, it did end a major storyline that was very emotionally impactful. Brian crying at least once per stream from Garlemald until the credits stopped rolling is my first thought in this case, and my goodness, there were definitely some big moments in that. We're not going to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen those. Anyway, and they might want just an easy 2 years to let people recharge, play other games like 16, come back in 7.0 with a renewed energy. Yes, this means that some players are going to feel unhappy about the general lack of reasons to play or too casual on some level, but I think lull is needed so people can rest and be ready for the future. Do you feel like Endwalker has had any kind of content lull since it released?
6.35 was a little light compared to previous half patches. And 6.4, in my opinion, actually hit a little heavy. And 6.45 does not look like it had to give anything up to make that happen. So I do have to wonder if maybe we could have taken 1 or 2 features from 6.4 and pulled them into 6.35 to give a more balanced experience. But no, I feel the total content's been there. There are some things like Criterion was a big piece of content, but because the rewards were lackluster, it didn't have the life cycle that it could have. And the fact that the relic didn't tie into it, where you could go run your Criterion each week to get some relic progression or something like that as an alternative path. Like when we did last expansion, we had multiple paths. That kind of like let it kind of die on the vine. But no, I think total content, if you just wrote down the number of pieces of content and the average number of hours it would take somebody to clear that, Endwalker's been punching fine. Narratively, however, I think it is a much needed rest. And Yoshi P talked about how, like, to let Endwalker sink in, you have to let those adventurers rest. Like, if they just immediately the world was in danger again.
The next big bad, yeah.
That's one of the big complaints of WoW, is that every time you've like finally saved the entire universe, they're like, except that you haven't saved the universe of universes. And so like people get kind of fatigued with that. And so, one of the things that 14 does well is it brings out, there are times that there is an existential threat to all people, and that's a big deal. There are times that it is a more narrow threat to a small group of people and can hit just as hard because you're saving those people. So it doesn't have to be the entire planet is at risk to the same degree every single time. As far as the 16 tax, that actually, they've been working on 16 since, I believe, Stormblood. And so when you have people like Koji giving way to Kate, like that, that's not an effect on Endwalker. I'm not saying that like there has not been attacks throughout time and all of that. And I'm not saying they're not hoping that 16 does very well, but 14, if there ever was attacks, it would likely have affected Stormblood and Shadowbringers. By now, I would think a lot of that would have leveled out because they've had, 4 to 6 years to let those people kind of age into those roles as those have been handed off. We are just now becoming aware of it publicly because Yoshi P keeps things so much closer to the chest than other devs who maybe talk about an MMO that doesn't have a release date or even nailed down systems. And so like Yoshi P, when he works on a project, be it 14 or otherwise, he keeps that stuff really close to the chest. If we go back to Stormblood at the time, there were times in interviews, especially at things like FanFest, where people would say, if you could ever work on a game outside of Square Enix, or if you could work on a game outside of Final Fantasy XIV, what would you do? And he would say, well, this isn't really the place to talk about something like that. But to answer it briefly, if I could, and then he would give a description of the kind of game he would love to make. Many of those descriptions actually line up a great deal with what 16 became. So he was just talking from like, here's the thing I'm already working on. So he was kind of leaking what he was working on. So I don't think the tax part is as heavy of a hitter. I think that the rest is something that's, I think the second half of this comment really hits on like letting us breathe as players, I think is the bigger driver.
I think that's important. I think the other thing a lot of people tend to forget about in terms of like the development approach to it is that Yoshi P, like his skill in terms of management and leadership, is that a lot of this stuff is planned out, worked, budgeted, and everybody kind of just remembers how they are now. But one of the things that happened when we were all in lockdown is Square Enix still released content, and to where other companies and everybody else was like, how is this even happen? Hell, Soken was fighting cancer, still putting out stuff while he was fighting cancer in the hospital. Like beyond like that one moment, they still had a plan. It wasn't like the only thing they had to figure out was how do we do this remotely. However, I think what we end up seeing, especially with the patch content, where people might necessarily feel that is that before the big rush of, Stormblood leading into Endwalker, and we saw like that massive influx of players where like the numbers were just going up millions by millions. Like every time they got together, it's like, well, we were at 22 million. Did we say 22? We meant 25. Did we say 25? We're now at 27. Like, it's like just like to the where the servers were just literally could not handle the influx when all of a sudden everybody who was on a break decided to come back at the same time. But during all that, during the budget and the planning, before all that rush, like you had to, sit here and do the budget of what the people we are working on, what also is going on with Creative Business Unit 3. That's why I think 16 being finished here in a couple of weeks will be such an interesting time. And it's going to be such a really big time going into FanFest because of the nature of what they can then start to announce. And so I don't necessarily think that the next patch is going to all of a sudden, like with the 0.5 that you're going to see like, oh, and here's all this extra content that you felt like, that somebody might feel is quote unquote missing. But I do think that that's going to help set up the narrative for what is to come in the expansion. But I would still want to caution as we start talking about 7.0, Chris and I are both like 2024, maybe March, like maybe May, like start thinking in that time frame, because I still see people online talk about how 7.0 is going to be out this Christmas. And I'm just like, if they did that for
Japanese Fan Fest.
Right, exactly. That's
just the base level. Like what would that be about? What would Japanese Fan Fest be hyping?
I don't know. Not even hyping, but it's like, oh, nobody showed up because they're all out playing the game, unless they were like,
yeah, I think that one out. Now that we have a date for Japanese Fan Fest, we didn't always, but now that we do, it said early 2024, but there were some people that kind of thought like, well, if that's January 1st, but like now that we have a date, like I definitely don't think it's anywhere before that date. As a matter of fact, like I don't think it'd be the week after that date, because I think that the media tour would be after that. The media tour has historically been about a month out. So if they do another media tour, I would think you would come out of FanFest, do the media tour at a minimum a month later, and then at a minimum do the expansion a month later, which puts you at a March release time at the earliest. It could easily push later. And then of course, there's always the wild 5%, 1% chance speculation that we get, a bigger 0.55 cycle, or the even wilder speculation of what if we had the mythical, elusive, never going to happen 0.6. I'd love to see a 0.6. Imagine if the raid story got one more.
That would be, I think, honestly, that would be a kind of a refreshing kind of take, because the 0.5 with 0.55 tends to be the longest running patch. It ends up being the moment where so many players come back, so many players get caught up in the story because you have the expansion hype, leads into the expansion, and then they kind of then go take the break, and then everybody else who's like continuing to play sticks around because they've got 0.1 and then 0.2, and you get kind of into that like, oh, here's what's coming. Now Wolf of the Fallen says, I don't even understand why people complain about having nothing to do when there is plenty for me to do in 14. The problem isn't why is there nothing to do as much as why is there nothing to do for me. And I think that rings true. That's something that you and I've kind of talked about numerous times, is that a lot of people, the argument isn't, or the counterpoint to go push back on somebody who's like, I don't have anything to do, is that, have you done everything? Because not necessarily everything will resonate, but I think ideally the conversation should shift to, have you tried these other things? Like, not necessarily like, do you need to master it, but like, have you tried that system? Because sometimes you might not know what resonates with you as a player until you actually go hands-on with it. And that's something that I find for me, whenever I try something that I'm like, it usually isn't my thing, to be surprising. Namely, one thing that continues to be confirmed to me is MOBAs. I've tried MOBAs, and I just haven't found any single MOBA that I actually enjoy. Therefore, I can confidently at this point in time say I don't enjoy MOBAs, but not necessarily is there something that will, I know that I've been surprised multiple times, especially like within Gathering. Like I really enjoyed, Gathering in some games where like before trying it, I never resonated with it. Do you have any thoughts on this?
It's why things like LOL achievements and stuff breathe a whole new life into a game for me. It's why I get so frustrated when achievement panes and daily challenge logs and quest logs and all that don't integrate with each other. Something that can better integrate achievements, something closer to, the Guild Wars 2 approach of like everything being achievement starts to give some level of credence. It can be hard to use for a newer player, so it's not that there aren't caveats to that, but like 14 has a lot to do that is not tied to achievements. For being a narrative-based game, there are a lot of beautifully written side quests throughout Endwalker that people haven't done. And so if you really do like the game for story and you've run out of things to do because the story is a fraction of the total hours that the average longtime player has put into the game, one of the things you could do to get more story is have you done the side quest. This expansion, they've been adding quests after each kind of MSQ step. That's wonderful. There's some really great quests. There's a quest that takes you through the backstory of the 4 Archfiends, and it's amazing. It's amazing. It's a beautifully written quest. It's got these great little cinematics. And so I think that they're not voice acted, so you have to just kind of love it to love it. But there's a lot of really great stuff there. And having achievements like WoW's Lore Master, or having map completion like Guild Wars 2, or some system to say like, hey, we're just going to give you 20 bicolor gemstones if you complete all the side quests in an area. Whatever, it doesn't matter. Just some little carrot to make people go, I did it because it gave something and I hadn't done it before, and I actually really had a great time. Because it does become a little more sandbox as soon as you've gotten past the MSQ and the battle content you like to do, whether that be PvP or Savage or whatever. As soon as you get past that, you have to start saying, I'm going to go catch all the big fish, or I'm going to go get a bunch of old relics, or... So it becomes a little more sandboxy, and it's kind of a big cliff where you just kind of like, you're on this paved road and then you're just in the sand. And I'd like to see that be a little more like you transition from a paved road to pavers to a dirt path to sand. So it's not just immediately like finding old achievements feels just as foreign to a newer player as going and engaging in the RP community. I would like to see that gap get bridged a little bit by Square officially. Instead of being third-party tools and members of the community guiding it, which is great. There are great Discords, LOL achievements, and others are great. But it'd be nice to see Square take a more active role in that.